G'day everyone, it's Rob here, and as you may have seen from the listing for this episode, tonight I'm absolutely delighted to have a long-time friend of the show, possibly the person who's guested on the show the most over the years, which is no mean feat for a show that doesn't really do guests, but somehow we still managed it, to talk about his new book, Doctor Who Myths and Legends, the Reeltime Pictures story. It's the one and only Emmy Award-winning Dylan Rees. Dylan, hello.
Hello. Wow. What an accolade. What an intro.
Oh, it's all true, isn't it?
I mean, I guess so. I had no idea I was the most, potentially the most guested person on the podcast. I feel honoured.
Yes, I think you are. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Amazing. Well, it's great to be here again, and I will come back anytime you will have me.
Oh, I think you'll be coming back soon, because Dave's already got an idea up his sleeve, but I won't drop that idea now on you. But I know he's got something.
Excellent.
Alrighty. Doctor Who Myths and Legends, the Reeltime Pictures story, is the book. And I want to rip straight in with some origins and motivation for this, Dylan. What drew you to Reeltime Pictures as a subject worthy of an entire book? Was it the research for your earlier book, Downtime, The Lost Years? Did that sort of spark your interest in delving deeper into real-time?
Well, it's funny because when I wrote my previous book, I said in the introduction, and obviously I won't be covering any of the factual releases from Reeltime Pictures because a making of might be sort of pushing the bounds of what's interesting. So I'm eating my hat. Through writing that book, I got to know Keith Barnfather, who runs Reeltime Pictures, and we stayed pals chatting, and I did go and help him out on a few productions here and there. And during lockdown, he was posting on Facebook little sort of like throwbacks to different myth makers and documentaries and dramas, just sort of going, oh, and Myth Makers 3, we filmed here, and these people were involved, and this happened that was quite funny, and this guest is no longer with us, and all this stuff. And I was like, oh, these are quite interesting. And I dropped him a message and just sort of said, oh, you should really write a book. And he went, oh, I haven't got time for that. And we were chatting, and he was like, well, Reeltime Pictures is going to be 40 years old in 5 years' time, which seemed like a lifetime at that point. And he said, well, you could write a book. And I was like, oh, I don't have the time for that. And then during lockdown, my brother came to live with me for many complicated reasons. And I mentioned to him, I was like, I was discussing to Keith Barnfather that somebody should do a book about Reeltime Pictures. And he went, well, what would it be about? And we were sat in the kitchen and having a cup of tea. And I was still there 2 hours later telling him exactly what it should be. And he said, well, nobody else is going to write this book, are they, apart from you, so you should do it. And so that's how it started. And from there, we got into touch with David J. Howe, who had, him and Keith are great friends, so it seemed like the natural home. It was not a given that he'd take the book, obviously, but he was the first and only approach. And here we are 5 years later.
Amazing. I've long said that Keith Barnfather is one of the unsung heroes of Doctor Who fandom. I've said it many times on social. I've said it directly to Keith once in an email. And by that, I don't mean he's some sort of complete unknown, but he does sort of fly slightly below the radar. I don't know how he pulls that off. Producing all this content for decades that's so important for us to have, all these interviews with Doctor Who luminaries, but he's never been particularly showy about it, I don't think.
No, I don't, because it's not his main line of business, and his career isn't Doctor Who. Reeltime Pictures have done broadcast television work, they've done documentaries, they've done a lot of corporate work and things like that. And the Doctor Who stuff, of which there is obviously a huge amount, was very much him sort of like, he didn't do it to lose money or anything like that, but he always wanted to, and quite often broke even or made profits on things. But he did it because he loved Doctor Who, so he wasn't pushing it in the same way that if you were trying to make this your living, you would have to push it. It was just there for the people who knew and the people who wanted to enjoy it. Obviously, he wanted people to buy it and wants people to buy it, but, it's not being given a huge marketing push because he doesn't have the budget, but also because he doesn't need to, because it's not his bread and butter.
My background with this, say, 1986, I'm 11 years old, I pick up Doctor Who magazine. There's advertisements all through it, but one in particular I think was for John Fitton Books and Magazines. And John Fitton Books and Magazines was selling the Mythmakers tapes. I thought, this is extraordinary. Like,
Yeah.
I can barely conceive this. Like, I can understand what it is, but at the same time, I can barely conceive this because no other show I watch has these third-party half-hour interview tapes with people from the show. That's what this is. My God, like, my mind was blown by that. You know, I didn't buy them because I was 11 years old, and they were, even at that time, I think you've got the prices in the book, they're possibly about £10 or so at the time.
Yeah.
That was a lot of money back then. You add on postage and so on. So I never bought them, but I knew they existed. And I thought, this is wild.
Yeah, I think it's a weird thing to discover they suddenly exist. And as you say, I looked around, like, there isn't a Star Trek or a Babylon 5 equivalent. Like, there is the odd cash-in documentary, and I use the word cash-in not because Reeltime are cash-in, but a lot of the time it's very hastily thrown together, straight to video. It's some commercial company who've got an archive interview with William Shatner, and then they've gone to a Star Trek convention and got 10 minutes with Leonard Nimoy in 1981 or something like that, and they've slapped it together with a host who doesn't care about the product, and they're just hoping that a Star Trek fan will go into, you know, a HMV or wherever, a Virgin Megastore, and go, oh, look at that. That's going to be a good documentary on Star Trek, pay their money, and then find out it's not.
Yeah. There were at least a couple of those I remember in the 90s that were sold here in like Kmart or Target, you know, like big mainstream shops, and these unofficial Doctor Who related VHS tapes were for sale in there. I remember that sort of stuff vividly.
Yeah. In more recent years, Keith has gone into preserving other releases that have sort of disappeared, that perhaps, you know, a group of fans got together or a company got together in the 90s and made a little documentary, and that includes, I mean, one of them is called Who is Tom Baker Unauthorized, and it is exactly one of those cash-in documentaries that are, as you say, available in supermarkets and things like that, and it's not very good, but what Keith's done is found out who owns it, restored it, and then put a little documentary to go, well, why isn't this very good? How did it happen? And so it exists there forever for us in a way that it had long disappeared from the high street and was just not available anywhere.
Yeah, it's a really good thing to do. I guess Reeltime's always operated in a kind of in-between liminal Doctor Who space. Was that part of the appeal? The fact their work is unofficial, but it is incredibly significant at the same time. Yeah,
I mean, there's sort of two aspects of their work, isn't there? There's the drama, which is, you know, they were the first people to make independent Doctor Who related drama, and there is a lineage from that film, which was Wartime, featuring Sergeant Benton, through to the countless big finishes and stuff we get today. And I don't think you can underestimate the importance of him just proving it was possible that Doctor Who fans could make drama. I quite like that space that it exists, that the dramas exist in, of just sort of like, it's kind of doing what a lot of media do now, albeit unofficially, where these things, they jump into different characters and alien races and things like that, and just explore their world and sort of further the Whoniverse a little bit. And I think that's a really nice place to exist. And then with the interviews, obviously they're not bound by any sort of BBC guidelines or anything like that. They don't have to toe the party line. So especially in sort of the early and mid-90s, when the show really is sort of, you know, not seen in the best light, people can be as honest as they want about the show, and sometimes it's incredibly positive and sometimes it's a bit more negative.
Yeah, that's true. How do you think Reeltime managed to maintain that working relationship with actors, writers, other creatives from the series without that sort of BBC backing over the years? Did it make it easier or was it harder?
I think it probably was easier. I think that it sort of spawned out of Keith and the people who worked on the early Mythmakers, for instance. They were the first group of organised fans, so they were the ones that set up the first Doctor Who convention, set up the DWAS, which wasn't the first Doctor Who fan club, but it was certainly the largest and the most prominent. They were the first people to reach out to the people who were making the show. And also, it's not just Doctor Who fandom that's evolving, it's fandoms in general. So it's before the sort of monetisation of fandom, and I don't just mean expensive signatures and photos. I mean realising that it was something that could be exploited. And actually, in the early days, a lot of these people just were really happy to be interviewed because they were happy that somebody was interested in their work and wanted to talk about it. And like, we didn't realise at the time, but that a lot of those early myth makers as well would obviously capture people who are no longer with us and haven't been for many years, like the sort of big one being Ian Marter was interviewed and died before his tape came out.
Yeah. Yeah, because I guess Reeltime did operate in a niche that might even be sort of hard for people to imagine now. We've touched on it, but what kind of creative freedoms or restrictions do you think they faced being the first to do this?
I think Keith has never wanted to annoy the BBC, you know. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think when I wrote this book, one of the things I was set out to do was, in my previous book, perhaps Keith's achievements were slightly overshadowed by the more salacious nature of Bill Bagg's work, and they're two very separate entities. One thing about Keith is, through interviewing people for this book and for the previous one, nobody's ever said, oh, you know, he has bad business practices or anything like that. And I think that was one of the key things. He was always keen to tread a line that was like, I will let you say what you want, it is your opinion, or we will do what we want within the world of the drama. We are licensing these characters, these monsters, off their creators. So, you know, they are officially licensed from said creators, but they'd never overstep the mark and do anything that might upset the BBC, because ultimately they realise that they exist at sort of the behest of the BBC, and this could be taken away from them if they overstep the mark at any point.
Let's move into then, we've touched on, you know, obviously fans are out there buying these tapes, so the cultural and the fan impact of this stuff. How did fans respond to Reeltime's productions as they started coming out, and has, in your opinion, that perception evolved over the years?
Yeah, I think when it first started, I think people were a bit like, so what actually is this? The first two myth makers happen in sort of 1984, 1985, and it's Michael Wisher and John Leeson, and they're sort of 30-minute interviews. And in one sense, we look at that now and go, oh, what, a 30-minute interview with Michael Wisher? Sure, great, whatever. But at the same time, there was no VAM. The VHS releases, I think it had just started. I think Revenge of the Cybermen had just happened or was about to happen.
Yeah.
But there was certainly no VAM or anything like that on there. I think the first thing we get remotely like VAM is the Silver Nemesis release, which it happens in the mid-90s.
Yeah, a long time after.
Yeah, where you've got that documentary on the end. And then certain groups of fans were used to seeing these actors at conventions and things like that. But in a way, this brings the convention feel a little bit home to the fans, and it does make you closer to the person being interviewed, because I can go on YouTube now and see any modern Doctor Who star being interviewed 5 times, but it was a rarity back in the day. Mm-hmm. And then you might get an interview in Doctor Who magazine or in DWB or a fanzine or whatever, and they were great interviews, but sometimes it's hard to get the measure of a person in an interview, and it's at the behest of the editor and the interviewer giving you the answers that they deem relevant for that. And you don't get the little quirks and emotional ticks and all the things you do when you see somebody interviewed for the first time. So while it was a slow uptake, I mean, the fact that we're here 40 years later, I think really says that people responded well to these things and the content of them. And sort of now there are many interviews with Doctor Who stars available all over the internet. But I think it's really about completing that classic series, I think, and the rate of myth makers has slowed down, but they exist there, and they're getting into the more niche people who are still with us and getting some really interesting interviews. I mean, one that came out a few years ago was with Kate Eastle, who was John Nathan Turner's secretary. And she's not doing loads of conventions or anything like that. And you might go, oh, John Nathan Turner's secretary? Why do I care about that? But it's fascinating because you get to really learn about the day-to-day runnings of the Doctor Who production office during the 1980s and all the little nuances of the relationships and the, you know, John's prickly side, which is very famous, and John's generous side. And then she went on to go and work for the ill-fated Doctor Who movie, The Last of the Time Lords, and worked for that company for a few years. And it's like just all these little bits of insight that... Okay, perhaps in 1989 she wouldn't have been the most obvious person to interview, but now it's really important. And I think that's what the fans are reacting to now. When it first started, it was they were reacting to getting to meet the stars for the first time. Now they're reacting to getting to meet perhaps some of the more niche stars and hearing their stories. And also, sadly, they're getting people to tell their stories for the last time as well.
Yeah, that's very true. Do you think, Dylan, that Reeltime helped shape the wider fan landscape, especially during the wilderness years, but more broadly as well?
Yes, I do. I think creatively, as I said before, they showed it was possible to do Doctor Who dramas, and that spawns BBV, it spawned Shakedown, and eventually helps spawn Big Finish. And a lot of those people who were involved in Big Finish were involved in various ones of Keith's productions. And, sometimes perhaps they thought, I can do better. And other times they thought, I can have a go at this. And, went out and tried to varying degrees of success. So I think in terms of drama, they definitely did. In terms of what we get on the collection and the Blu-rays and on the DVDs and the little bits of VAM we got on the later era VHSs, I think you can't help but be sort of informed by what Reeltime did. I mean, they were the first people to sort of throw together retrospectively a making of Doctor Who documentary with something like Return to Devil's End, looking specifically at the demons. And now pretty much every story has got a documentary like that. Just going out there and proving there were stories to be told from all these different people, no matter how small their contribution to Doctor Who was, and sort of put those onto videotape and preserve them for posterity. So I think not only has it informed that, but also now we do see clips on the VAM, on the collection sets from Mythmakers popping up, because they're the only visual interview we've got with some of these people.
Yeah, hugely important stuff. Just going back, though, in terms of the dramas, do you see parallels between Reeltime's output there and today's fan film culture or indie spin-off productions?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because I suppose the natural progression, weirdly, you'd think it'd come the other way, it is the fan films that you see on YouTube now. And I think certainly the ambition's there, but... And I don't mean this in a negative way. Keith was making something for a budget, and does make something for a budget that he wants to recoup and hopefully make a profit on. So I think he always had in his mind the business side of things, even though, as I said, it wasn't his main source of income. So I think there is a lineage there, and again, just proving it's possible that you can go out and make a drama on a low to no budget. But ultimately, a lot of fan films are made for the love and for free with amateurs, and Keith's dramas are ultimately a bunch of professionals or aspiring professionals sometimes who would then go on to have careers in the media.
So more towards the indie sort of side of things rather than fan films.
Yeah, exactly. It perhaps leans more towards indie filmmaking than the fan film. I mean, if are they professionally produced fan films? I suppose that's probably where those things lie to a certain extent. But it is, it's professional writers, directors, people who make a living off doing these jobs, creating these things, or people who would go on to make a living off these things. I mean, Andy Lane, who wrote Wartime, the very first one. He went on to write a lot of Doctor Who books, but he's now a hugely successful author. Like, it happened to him a little bit later in life, but he quit his job as a teacher and he writes Sherlock Holmes books for kids that he's been doing now for a decade plus, and they're massively successful.
Yeah, it's huge. Do you have a favourite amongst the dramas?
I will always have a soft spot for Downtime, because that came out in 1995, and although there'd been rumours for 5-6 years plus that Doctor Who was coming back, like, it just wasn't. That's how it felt to me. And ultimately, I'd be proved wrong the next year, but it would come and go. And it seemed so big and epic at the time. And I know it's very easy to watch it now and go, it's shot on videotape, this 50-minute Yeti film, and perhaps the Yetis don't look fantastic. But the effort that people went to make that film, like, there's explosions and, like, vast locations and a traffic jam in the middle of London and extras and all the things that you don't get in a fan film. Like, whether you think it's the best film ever made or the worst film ever made, it is a professional production putting new life into characters from Doctor Who, giving quite a few of them sort of a last hurrah, and you can't help but walk away from and admire the ambition. And it was a hugely important thing to me growing up, having it, it felt like my Doctor Who.
Yeah, and I think that's hard for someone to look back on now, someone who might be, 15 years old, 20 years old, and quite see it in the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there was not just real-time stuff, but Shakedown and Bill Bag stuff for a few years only existed when the internet first started as VHS rips on YouTube, which do not give sort of the best image of what it makes those things look worse than they are in a way. But when you see Downtime on its DVD release all cleaned up, yes, it looks dated, but it looks like a bit of 1990s television shot on videotape. It's not like a million miles away from things you would see on TV at the time. It's not made with modern production values.
Let's pivot to the writing and research process, because I'm very interested in this. How did you go about researching myths and legend? Were there any particular archives you could dive into, interviews that maybe hadn't been released, materials that were especially valuable that you came across?
Well, my most valuable resource was Keith Barnfather.
Right.
Keith was obviously instrumental in writing this book, and we would have regular Zoom chats, interviews, I would say every few months for, basically 5 years. Sometimes there'd be short gaps between them, sometimes there'd be long gaps. Obviously, the way sort of making a book like this works is that you are doing it incrementally around your other commitments in life. So it did take 5 years, but at the same time, it wasn't like that's what I was doing every day for 5 years. But it was a lot of talking to him. And the first thing I had to do was sit down and just try to figure out the order that everything came out in and how things happened. So I sat down and I watched sort of the first 50 releases and looked up for various information on release dates. Keith had some, David J. Howe had some, a bunch of other fans came through with that got their own lists and stuff. And you sort of start to go, okay, when did that happen? When did that person arrive? When did that person leave? How many releases did they work on? Yeah. And you sort of build up an idea in your head, a framework of the people that were important to these productions. Stephen Payne and Jan Vincent Radzitsky, who were instrumental in the DWAS and set up Visual Imagination. They did TV Zone and Starburst. They directed a couple of the early myth makers and stuff. And so you kind of go, okay, well they've only done 2. Are they important? Yes, they are important because it was very early on, and they got some interesting stuff. And so you kind of have a hit list of all the people involved, and then you go, who are the ones I need to speak to? And they all, you find out if they're online, you find out if they're still with us, because unfortunately some people have passed away. And Stephen Payne, who's interviewed for the book, passed away about a year after I spoke to him, unfortunately. And so you're kind of building the story in your head and from there, I would go back to Keith and go, okay, so... And sometimes the chats I'd have with Keith would be very, okay, how did this come about? What did you feel about this? And and other times it was stuff that didn't necessarily make it into the book in a quote, but it was just like, can you remember why on this day you didn't shoot this? And like all the sort of questions Doctor Who people hate at conventions, but but just to try and build that history, and then it's sort of how do you make it interesting from there. And it's I realised very early on that it wasn't going to be about facts and figures. It was going to be about weaving the stories of these fans going out to make these things and building their careers, but also what it's like to interact with the stars of their favourite show. And I hope, especially in those early chapters where we're dealing with people who are no longer with us, the personalities perhaps of the stars of Doctor Who are told through the prism of the fandom meeting them. That was my intention, and to try and get a little bit of their personalities in there.
Yeah, which leads me to wonder, were there any contributors or personalities from Reeltime's history that were still with us and you wanted to talk to, but they were particularly hard to track down, or you didn't track them down?
There was one person who will remain nameless who declined.
Okay.
Not a major contributor. He just, for whatever reason, felt he didn't have anything to say on it. And not a major contributor, but I was trying to find the guy who directed John Nathan Turner's Mythmakers, because he was a friend of John's. And foolishly, when I started doing the book, I found him on Facebook, and I thought, when I get to that one, I'll contact him. And by that point, the great sort of Facebook exodus had happened a few years ago, and he had gone, and I couldn't find him anywhere else, and Keith didn't have a contact for him. And I would have... So that's my one regret, that I didn't get a chance to speak to him. Oh, and Damaris Heyman, she was in a home at the time, and I would have loved to have chatted to her, and I called up. Keith gave me the number of the home, and I called up a few times, and they just said, look, she's not well enough, and sure enough, she passed away not long after. And I mean, what can you do on that front? I mean, she's very well represented in there, because Keith did a lot of interviews with her around the White Witch, but I would have loved to have just got a few words from her. But, you know, she was very old at that point, and her health was declining.
Yeah, that's sad. Did any myths or misconceptions about Reeltime get debunked in your research?
Oh, that's an interesting one. Actually, yes. There's one thing that I wanted to put to bed, and I'd kind of touched on it in my downtime book, but even the publisher was convinced that this was the case. Even David J. Howe was convinced this was the case during the writing of this book, that Return to Devil's End started out its life as a drama rather than a documentary. And so that's put to bed, essentially. It doesn't happen. And the other thing I wanted to look at was there'd been mention that Reeltime tried to do a Dalek animated series, and I think it was mentioned in an interview once with Kevin Davis, and kind of got blown out of proportion as like a big pitch. It was just sort of an idea, and they did go that, you know, there were drawings made and some Dalek vocals done and things like that, but it really wasn't. It wasn't like months and months of work to pitch this thing. It was sort of off the cuff idea that they did a little bit of work on. So I just sort of wanted to. It was more the scale of that thing rather than this huge undertaking by them that never happened. That, like, there isn't an unreleased Dalek series somewhere where all the scripts exist and the concept art. It was just a bunch of mates who had the access to animation stuff through Kevin Davis, filming stuff through Keith, that they were going to try and pitch that, but it ultimately was dismissed by Terry Nation's agent pretty quickly.
So nothing that could be repurposed for CBeebies, perhaps?
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, unfortunately not.
In a similar vein, were there any unexpected stories from behind the scenes? You know, any tensions, triumphs, bizarre anecdotes that you came across?
I mentioned earlier about trying to sort of get the personalities of the people involved in the show. And I think, especially in the earlier chapters, I feel like I come away knowing a bit more about John Pertwee than the showman, like in terms of his relationship with fans and Keith and Nick Briggs and other people. And it may be a weird thing to say, like, there's 4 pages of coverage of John Pertwee's Mythmakers, which essentially is a Talking Heads interview in a few different locations. And you go, really? Can you get 4 pages of coverage of that? And it's like, well, you can when you're trying to get to understand John Pertwee and his, like, sort of the nature of the man through the prism of that interview. And the same with Tom Baker. Again, no, like, revelations, but there is... It's an understanding of where he was in his life. And then sort of the biggest revelation for me is there's a character called Jack Pitt, who he played a Venom Grub and various other extra roles in Doctor Who. And he shared digs with William Hartnell. Now,
oh wow,
his interview was a very interesting one, and I have a take on it, which I put in the book, and Keith has a take on it, which he talks about later in the book. Bearing in mind this interview's been out there for 20, 30 years, it completely changed my view on the sort of person William Hartnell was, and completely made sense of why he was the way that he was. But I'll leave that at that, and it's up for other people to. It's up for other people to, I would say, read the book and also watch the interview and decide for themselves.
Dylan, was there a moment in your research where you realised just how significant Reeltime's contribution had been? I mean, obviously you would have known that to some degree because you're writing a bloody book about it. but when you're actually researching it and more pieces fall into place, did you just sit back and think, holy shit, shit, look at this.
I think it was a gradual thing, and I'm a real-time fan. I wouldn't be writing this book if I wasn't. I think the Mythmakers in particular are hugely important in terms of the sort of cultural heritage of Doctor Who. And I had seen what I thought was a lot of Mythmakers, and I hadn't quite grasped how many there were. And I think it was when I was about 100 releases in, and I'd sort of been making notes on each of them, and I was just like, I was going through a particular run where it was all people from the 60s, and I was like, all of these people are dead. And I know this sounds an obvious thing to say. They weren't when they were interviewed. But, I remember buying a lot of them at the time and just going, oh, that's an interesting interview with Sean Sutton or Donald Tosh or Derek Sherwin or whoever. And so for me, those interviews have existed for so long that I'd never really sort of felt the scope of it and gone, oh my God, there's so many people who have passed away from those early interviews, and that's a running theme throughout them. Like you don't know when somebody's going to pass away a lot of the time, and for instance, Paul Bernard is another one who's interviewed and dies before his Mythmakers comes out. Same with the stage Dr. Trevor Martin many years later. And then also there's somebody, the other side of that is somebody like Barbara Clegg has been very ill when she records her Mythmakers, and you think she's not long for this world, and she only passed away quite recently. But it was certainly the last interview I think she probably gave on the subject because of her declining health.
What do you think Reeltime's lasting legacy is in the world of Doctor Who?
I think it is probably the definitive first-hand account of the making of the classic series. And I know a lot of these people have been interviewed elsewhere, and we talk about the DVDs and things like that, but especially those early Mythmakers, you are capturing them before the convention scene has corrupted their anecdotes. And I don't mean corrupted in a negative way, but people learn where they get a laugh from something and start to embellish a story. If you watch Tom Baker's Mythmakers, he is telling some stories that you've heard many times before, but he's telling them quite seriously because they haven't turned into punchlines and anecdotes at that point. It's just things that's happened, and they're much more subdued and much more real versions of that. So the early stuff, it is capturing people's anecdotes and memories while they're still relatively fresh. And sometimes they're talking about these things for the first time. Somebody like Wendy Padbury. We've all seen Wendy Padbury interviewed 1,000 times on DVDs, Blu-rays, conventions. When they came to do her Mythmakers in the early 80s, she hadn't talked about Doctor Who since she left, pretty much. She hadn't done any conventions. Same with Caroline John. So these memories are awaking for the first time. And then, as I mentioned, you get to the point where you're perhaps capturing people for the last time. But I do think it is the definitive history of classic Doctor Who.
Yeah, it's so very important. Absolutely. If Reeltime, Dylan, could produce one more Doctor Who spin-off today with no budget limitations, what do you think it should be?
Oh, that's interesting.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
I think, Keith's got 2 more dramas planned, but if there was anything that 12, 13-year-old me would have wanted to see was a sequel to Downtime. Another follow-up, maybe not featuring the Yeti, but the Brigadier, Sarah Jane, Kate Lethbridge-Stewart as played by Beverly Cressman, Cavendish as played by Miles Richardson. I would have liked to have seen them all in one last adventure. And they were supposed to get one, not in Downtime, but in Autumn, but then Nick Courtney was ill and Autumn went over to BBV, and so that never happened. And I just think another last hurrah for those characters altogether would have been wonderful. So yeah, I'm going Downtime 2.
Nice. What do you think's the most underrated real-time production that does exist? Oh,
there's so many of them.
You've worked on a real-time production, haven't you?
I've worked on a couple. I helped out for a day on White Witch of Devil's End when they were shooting that, and then the Mythmakers live stuff, which is sort of something Keith's been doing over recent years. I think that's a really interesting part of the format. In order to, it's 6 guests. It's sort of a mini convention, and they each get their Mythmakers in front of an audience, and it's a great way of sort of mopping up some of those people and giving a different angle doing it in front of a live audience. So, the most underrated, or perhaps lesser talked about ones. I'm not going to go for one, I'm going to go for a few, but they are hugely important. When Mythmakers first started doing things on DVD, they realised they'd been recording a lot of the 80s conventions, and they made little compilations called the Panopticon tapes, which had clips of panels and things like that. But when they went back to digitising things, they realised they had these full panels with people that, again, are no longer with us. So there's a release called the John Wiles team, which features obviously John Wiles, Dennis Spooner, Paul Erickson, William Ems, Donald Cotton. Then there's another one for the Innes Lloyd team featuring Innes Lloyd, Peter Bryant, Victor Pemberton, Michael Craze. There's another one with Don Houghton, and it's like people don't talk about these releases enough, but it's the only place you can see these people together talking about their time on the show. And I think that is really important, that there they are in the mid-80s on stage at a Doctor Who convention, chain smoking, talking about a job they did 20 years ago. And it's just lovely to see them all, the camaraderie they have, hear their anecdotes, and even if they're not particularly exciting anecdotes, like hearing Paul Erickson talk, and he's got this deep American accent, which I never knew, was just, enough for me.
Yeah.
And there's one for the Peter Bryant team as well, where you've got Peter Bryant, Maurice Barry, Derek Martinus, Victor Pemberton again. Just that era of Doctor Who where the people were involved, a lot of them died in the 80s, 90s, some of them in the 70s. Just again, I feel like I'm being quite morbid when I talk about these things, but you cannot underestimate how important having those things are, and I would recommend to people to go and track them down because they're hugely underrated and not talked about enough.
Yeah, and even for people who were around and in fandom, maybe even adults in fandom in the 80s, if you didn't live in the UK, or maybe even if you did live in the UK and you just didn't go to that convention, there's no way to see this stuff unless someone went and captured it and now releases it in this format. So, I completely get how important it is, yeah. I
mean, as you say, you're not from the UK. I'm from the UK. I didn't go to all those events. I mean, I wasn't old enough probably at that time, but there were 2,000-odd people that went to those 80s conventions, and there were a lot more Doctor Who fans in the UK and beyond. And the fact that stuff exists, because it sort of shouldn't, you wouldn't think Doctor Who fans were that organised at that point, but they were. And they just managed to capture it. I mean, one of the releases they do, on a slight tangent, is Keith organised the first ever Doctor Who convention. And he does a documentary about it, but he's also got the audio recordings, and they're very low quality, but the audio recordings of all the panels, because he wasn't expecting to release them professionally. He just put a tape player underneath the coffee table on the stage and recorded them. And it's really fascinating to... Again, you've probably heard all the stories before, but it's got Tom and Louise while they're still in the show. It's got John Pertwee not longer after he left the show. And Terence Dix and Graham... Somebody asked Terence Dix, very funnily, sort of, do you think the Green Death was too preachy? And I just thought, the more things change, the more they stay the same. If you change preachy for woke now, you could be at a Doctor Who convention now.
And it reminds me, when you talk about, fans being organised to do this stuff, it reminds me of a few years back, Doctor Who magazine found a kid. Well, he was a kid at the time. I think Pertwee had come to his school or something, and he'd interviewed Pertwee, and he found the old cassette. So they then had this interview with Pertwee that otherwise wouldn't exist. It's one of those things that, as you say, this shouldn't exist, but it does.
Yeah, absolutely. And all those things are important. And weirdly, the John Pertwee at that first Doctor Who convention, again, it's not a fantastic quality of audio or anything, but it's lovely to have. And it's him... His memories are sharper, and he has memories of individual stories. I can't remember exactly which ones they are, but say it's like the mutants and the Time Monster, in a way that years later he talks more very generally about his time on Doctor Who rather than having the intricacies of a particular story in his mind.
Yeah. Dylan, what's one thing about Reeltime Pictures that most Doctor Who fans don't know but should know?
Interesting. I think they should know that there are lots of people that have been involved and that have come and gone over the years, but the one consistent thing is Keith, and it's his driving force and his ability to get a production off the ground and to want to do these things that has kept these things going. And they've had over 250 releases over 40 years. And I think it's not a big company. It's a tiny little indie company. I've been round to Keith's Reeltime offices, and it's a treasure trove. That was another thing, sort of researching the book, going into his sort of archive of paperwork and things like that. But he's a one-man band who's made a very successful business outside of Doctor Who and Doctor Who on the side of it. And it really is all about the perseverance and passion of one individual, as much as there has been other passionate individuals who have helped out.
You're a creative. You're in his space looking at all this stuff. What lessons do you think creators today could take from Reeltime's resourceful approach, their scrappy approach, if that's not too rude? What could they take away from it?
Figure out, just get up and do the damn thing. For years in Doctor Who fandom, people had talked about the possibility of doing an official or semi-official drama. They talked about, doing interviews. They talked about doing conventions. And we can all sit there going, well, Reeltime Pictures should do this. The BBC should do that. BBC Studios should do that. If you want to do the thing, do the thing. And sometimes you'll get it right and sometimes you'll get it wrong. But I think in Keith's case, it largely went right for him.
Yeah.
And I think that the same with anything, like if you really want something, you're going to have to work hard. And you're probably going to lose some money at times and you're probably going to lose some sleep. But, anything worth doing is worth doing well, and it will be difficult. But just get up and do it.
Yeah, there's a Suede lyric. I think it's one of their early B-sides back in the 90s. And the lyric is, what you do in your head, you do in your head.
Well, very, very true.
And I've always thought that's so true. You just got to, get out of your head and just do it. Yeah.
Exactly.
If someone unfamiliar, Dylan, with Reeltime's work wanted to start watching, what would you recommend as a great entry point? And I know what a hell of a question that is.
I think if you're going for the Mythmakers, any one of the Doctors you can't go wrong with. They're all brilliant productions, they're all brilliant interviews, and you'll come away knowing those Doctors a little bit better. We haven't talked much about the documentary ranges. I think if you are a fan, if you want to get a more sort of broad strokes thing of what Reeltime do, I think Return to Devil's End, I Was a Doctor Who Monster, the Panopticon tapes, you'll get a varied history of parts of Doctor Who that perhaps you don't know, and a real sense of what they do. If we're talking about dramas, then I will always wave the flag for Downtime.
Brilliant. Dylan, we'll get to plugging the book in a moment, but I want to say first, thank you so much for sharing your time with me and the listeners tonight. It's been really fascinating to talk about this book.
No worries. Thank you so much for having me and for letting me talk about it. I feel like I've been sat in a room for 5 years, sort of plugging away at this thing, and for it actually to be out there. There came a weird moment about 4 or 5 months ago where I was like, I don't have to watch or think about any Mythmakers today. And that had been my life in some way, shape or form for even the days where I wasn't doing anything. I was like, right, on Saturday I've got to get through these 3 titles, write reviews of them, find out what that means. And so it's really weird to talk about it as a thing in the past and that it's a complete thing now. And I had a great time researching it and a great time talking about it today, and I hope people enjoy reading it.
Were you keeping your light under a bushel on this? Because I remember when I first saw you mention it on X, I think earlier this year, I was like, Dylan, you dark horse, where did this come from? 5 years?
Yeah, I think Keith mentioned it early on when we were talking about it, but I just wanted to make sure I got it right. And this is... So when I wrote my previous book, what I was able to do is deliver the book a chapter at a time, because you go, right, this is about the Stranger film in Memory Alone. I've interviewed everybody involved in Memory Alone. I know I've got all the information I need about it. Here you go to the publisher. They read it. They make some notes, send it back, whatever. This book was terrifying because I couldn't give them a copy of the book until it was completely finished. So if I'd have got it wrong, I would have written an entire book. Because Nick Briggs does the first sort of 60, 70 myth makers and then comes back for other ones at the end. I've got to watch all these myth makers, do my research, interview other people. So I can't interview Nick Briggs about myth makers number 2 and Day of the Daughters, which is the most recent thing he did, until I've seen everything in between. And also, like, I'm interviewing people that are involved in, say, myth makers 1 to 50 and Downtime. And then eventually I've got to get to the point where I've seen and written about all the other stuff in between to get to Trevor Martin's myth makers and Syl and the Devil Seeds of Arador. And there was a point where I was working on the final chapter of the book, but there were still blanks in chapter 2, 3 and 4, which you can't deliver to somebody. So that's why I sort of kept it under my hat, because I was terrified I'd deliver something and they go, this wouldn't work. At which point I would have turned it into a blog or something like that.
If you want to get your hands on a copy of Doctor Who Myths and Legends, the Reeltime Pictures story, dear listener, it will be launched at the Whooverville 16 convention on the 30th of August. That's next weekend in Derby in the UK. If you're not at that event, you can hit up Tellus Publishing at tellus.co.uk and pre-order a copy there right now. Dylan, you're looking forward to Whooverville?
I am indeed, yeah. If anybody's there, I'll be wandering around and I'll be more than happy to talk real-time pictures with anybody who wants to talk about it. And if people really want my signature in the front of it, I will sign anything for the 4 people that want it signed.
Bless. Now, we said tellus.co.uk there. Telos, there's a whole other fan sort of venture that's produced all sorts of interesting stuff and grown over the years. I'm just stroking my chin here, Dylan. Is that another story for another time, perhaps?
Well, I think David J. Howe's just written his memoir, so hopefully that'll encompass that. I mean, never say never, but again, David and Keith are good friends, and they were part of the early days of the DWAS. David worked on early myth makers and things like that. They're very similar people in that respect. Their careers took them in on different paths, but they're the guys that decided, do you know what, I think there is a market for this and I want to do this. And Telos went out and set up, their publishing company and have published some amazing books, not just on Doctor Who, but original fiction and genre media and things like that. So they've got a huge library, and again, it's a testament to Doctor Who fans that there are people within us that just have that get up and go to preserve the history of the show and be creative at the same time.
Yeah, skills in certain areas that they can bring to bear and run a publishing company and put out books and things.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you so much again. This has been really fascinating to chat about. I've loved my sneaky peek at the book, and I think our listeners out there will too.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you again for having me, and thanks to everybody for listening.
No worries. See you next time, Dylan.
See you later.
On VHS, the legend survived. Keith kept the whole universe, the spirit alive. Myth makers talking, secrets untold. Behind the scenes stories worth more than gold. Interviews, dramas, a phantom's delight. From wartime soldier to downtime's fight, he captured stuff we'd otherwise lost. Keith got it down, whatever the cost. Keith, our real-time kingpin. Doctor Who love, through thick and thin. Keith, the tapes we adore. Now Dylan's book keeps the record stored. With Pertwee laughs and Mary Tam's grace, Tom's wild grin and McCoy's mad face, Reeltime stayed when the BBC quit. Keith stoked the fire, he kept it lit. Tales from the TARDIS behind the scenes, Dalek nightmares and Gallifreyan dreams. No doctor needed, the story survived. Thanks to Keith, the fandom thrived. Keith, our real-time kingpin. Doctor Who love, through thick and thin. Keith, the tapes we adore. Now Dylan's book keeps the record stored. Real-time, fans unite. Doctor Who forever bright. Keith, for that's his name. He kept alive the Whovian flame. Keith, our real-time kingpin. Doctor Who love, through thick and thin. Keith, the stories we crave. From Dylan's book to the tapes he saved. Real-time forever, Whovians true. Keith and Dylan, we thank you.